So we get into this conversation a lot around what it means to actually work through a method where we split out cost and demand and what that looks like. And this is really a very interesting analysis. This is also Gartner. This was from 2004. It was a very interesting piece of research, and I think what's fascinating to me is I think what Gartner put together and their view of it was insightful, but I think they missed the importance. So as we go through this, I want to show you not only what they said, but the way to interpret this and understand what's happening. So up this column here on the left-hand side are different ways that companies can move money across cost centers or across business units or across legal entities. And this methodology, the way we move stuff, is up across the column here. Let me just kind of take a minute and explain. Allocations, high and low level allocations, basically mean we have a block of cash that goes to the IT department, and then somebody comes in and says we're going to distribute or align those expenses out on some driver, and in most cases, if it's a high level allocation, it's a revenue by business unit. So if this business unit is 20% of the revenue for the company, they get 20% of the IT cost. Doesn't actually matter what they consume or how they drive costs, they get 20%. A low-level allocation functions the same way. We might just break it up and say maybe we do infrastructure on headcount and we do non-infrastructure, so the applications we do at a revenue basis. A direct cost is where in a cost center hierarchy, actually inside of an organization, the exact cost related to a business unit, their IT, is in that same cost center. So visibly inside of the general ledger, it all looks like one cost. This, by the way, was back when we had decentralized IT. So this went away when the notion of centralization of IT as an economic benefit to the organization came up in the mid-90s, and we started centralizing everything. And you know, when you have really old leadership in a company, when you sit down with them and have a conversation and they say, back in whatever, we used to have all the cost in my area and I just knew what it was, right? So this direct cost concept is when it's, broken out into pieces across the organization. Measured resource usage and tiered flat rate are basically like the old cell phone plans. You get 500 anytime minutes and 24 weekend minutes and overage from there. Negotiated flat rate, this is my personal favorite. This is where I come to you and say, I'm going to give you $1 million IT and you're going to give me everything I want, right? We call that suicide. If you accept that view as an organization, you're going to be in big trouble. By the way, if you ever wonder how an outsourcer gets your business all excited, they come in at negotiated flat rate. I'm going to charge you a fixed fee and I'm going to give you everything you want. And that excites the business like crazy. But as soon as they get into that relationship, they recognize that's not necessarily the case. And the last is service-based pricing, which is basically this notion, I have a set of services, you consume them, and I charge you for those services. So this was Gartner sort of laying this out. And then Gartner said, there's a dimensionality that each one of these types of movement kind of fits against. I call them the emotions, right? Because if you ever notice, if you put a dollar sign in front of a number, people get emotional. Like I could say 5, and everybody's like, but I say $5, and people are like, ooh. Every time you put a dollar sign, people get emotional. So these are the emotions. One is simplicity. How easy is it for me to understand the model you're describing, the simplicity of that model? The other is fairness. Fairness means you charge me the right amount. I'm getting charged the right amount. Predictability. How much are you going to charge me next week, next month, next quarter, next year, 3 years from now? And controllability. I make a decision, and that decision shows up in my numbers in a reasonable amount of time. So these are the emotions that are related to how people react to money. And so in the time that we have spent walking around and talking to companies, simplicity typically is the IT department, right? Those guys just don't like when things get complicated. Money and IT like oil and water, they don't work well together. Fairness is typically a budget person who was told by their boss, you better not be more than 3% off target. And they spend all their time going, that $25 is not mine. That $25 is not mine. Predictability is finance. Those guys always want to know next week, next quarter, next month, 3 years from now. And controllability are line presidents who want to know they can make a decision about their business and it shows up in their P&L in a reasonable amount of time. So Gartner went through and they said, okay, based on these methodologies, how well does each methodology actually address these emotions? And if it's green, it does it really well. If it's blue, it does okay. If it's yellow, it's not so great. If it's blank, it obviously sucks. So the first question I'm going to ask you is to point out the methodology that has all green dots. There isn't one. So the first rule of IT financial management is somebody is not going to like you. You cannot make everybody happy. So we have to pick who we're not going to make happy. That's part of the process. This is part of why IT financial management has a huge challenge, because we're trying to make everybody happy. Inherently, the process won't permit it. So I look up here and I say, okay, well, what's close? Well, negotiated flat rate has 2 blues and 2 greens. That's probably the best, but remember what we call that suicide. So let's talk about what this means. Well, is it predictable? Well, yeah, if I came to you and said I'm going to give you $1 million and you're going to give me everything I want, how predictable is the cost? It's $1 million. Is it controllable? Absolutely. It's controllable. If I told you I'm going to give you $1 million and you're going to give me everything I want, it's very controllable. Is it fair? Not necessarily, because if you've ever run an IT department, you know exactly what happens. The person in this scenario, the individual who's got the biggest political clout or the biggest mouth, demands for their $1 million way more than that $1 million would supply. Who pays for the difference? IT doesn't have any money. Another business unit pays by getting less for the services that they are paying for. So it is certainly not fair. It's relatively simple. All right, so we know that's not good. It's suicide, so we don't want to do that. So what else looks good? Well, that direct cost thing, right? So it's got 3 blues and 1 green. So the green is controllability in the business unit. Remember what I said direct cost was? Is where we break up IT into decentralized pockets and we put them back in the silos they used to operate under inside each. So the business is thrilled. They own their own IT now. It's inherently financially not very economically viable and potentially has other challenges with it. So as you go through the process, you can see that really none of these does a great job, but I'm going to actually make a case for you as why I think service-based pricing is so effective. So I will tell you it's fair. It's got a big green dot. Why is it fair? Well, in this process, if I came to you and I said, why did you charge me for 10 phones? Do you have 10 phones? Yes. How do I get charged for fewer phones? Have fewer phones. I mean, it's a pretty straightforward process. Phones are $35 a month. How do I get them to $30 a month? That is the best type of conversation you want to have, because now we can talk about what IT can do and the value of doing it. I would say it's predictable and controllable, and I know it's blue, but we can make it green. And the way that we can make it green, if you remember when we talked about budgets and forecasting before, if I am IT controlling the price, the unit price, I can bring in the business partner to talk about how much they're going to consume. If I'm talking to the finance team and they want to know about predictability, same thing. So the only thing that happens in service-based pricing is it's hard. The model can be complex, and who doesn't like complexity in the model? IT. That's the biggest challenge that we face today. Interesting chart. I'm not sure Gartner understands all the pieces and parts. Low-level, high-level allocation. Biggest problem, slow response to changes in IT, potentially misleading cost indicators, and complexity to manage this is outside of a system, typically on spreadsheets. We already talked about the decentralization of IT with direct cost. Tiered flat rate and measured resource usage is widget-oriented. And the problem is in a widget-oriented conversation, I'm talking about the pieces and the parts. This is a lot like me coming up to you and saying, here's your car. Your car has 17,311 bolts. They're 6 cents a piece. Your car has 4 doors. They're $1,700 a piece. There are 14,000 stitches in the leather, and they're 8 cents. This is not a conversation anybody wants to have. How much is the car is the question. Not a transparency model and negotiated flat rate, and that's why we end up with service-based costing. The industry understands and is moving towards service-based pricing. The problem is the methods that we get there with are not well understood and not particularly mature.